morning, North Point. I hope everyone is doing well. My family and I are out of town for a wedding and then just a little vacation, so we created this video message for you this morning. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we have been looking at a few different narratives that highlight for us some of the struggles that the disciples of Jesus were facing and then what we can learn from them. And because in so many ways, we aren't much different than them. And of course, we have all been formed and shaped under different cultural norms and maybe even under a different set of social values. But the principles Jesus guides them with are just as applicable to us as they have always been. So what does this mean for us? What it means is that these principles that Jesus taught are practical and relevant for us today. And I hope you see that. Now, the narrative we're going to cover today has a core message that is so important for all of us to not just hear, but to embrace. And in fact, it's something we could all benefit from, and it's found in Matthew 17, verses 24 through 27. But before we get there, let's recap how we got here. So Jesus and three disciples are up on a mountain where they witness Jesus have a conversation with Moses and Elijah. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the mountain, the remainder of Jesus' disciples find themselves caught up in some tension with some of the scribes. Evidently, the disciples were struggling to cast out a demon, and the scribes seized the opportunity to call them out and discredit them. And this is what Jesus and the other three disciples come upon when they make it down the mountain. It was a scenario with multiple characters or groups of people who were all having their own struggles with what was going on. So the scribes had issues with Jesus and his disciples because they were not teaching or maintaining orthodoxy. And the father of the son who was being attacked by this demon, he just wanted to save the most precious thing he had to his name, his son. He had found no hope from the religious authorities, and none of the disciples of Jesus weren't able to help either. And then you have the disciples themselves who seem to be struggling to figure out their place among the group. They, for some unknown reason to them, are not now able to do something that they once had the power to do. Tension is building among the group, and they're arguing about who the greatest will be, and some are even asking to be placed above the rest. They just seem to be struggling all the way around. Now, when they get back to Capernaum, Jesus is going to address this issue. And this is something we covered several weeks ago. This is when they are all in this house and Jesus asks them about what was going on. And then he uses a child as an object lesson to help them see the perspective they needed to adopt as his disciples. See, they were going about all this the wrong way. Like, they were seeking prestige and honor in the typical fashion of that day. But Jesus turns all that upside down and uses the example of a child and a servant to illustrate the right perspective. And so essentially, children and servants represent those who have no social status. They are told who they are and what they're to do. They were often marginalized and looked down upon. And so Jesus tells them that they need to humble themselves like children, like servants. And it's because from Jesus' perspective, humility is what leads to greatness. And when you think about what it really takes for a grown adult to humble themselves like a child or a servant, you begin to understand how humility is a point of strength and not a weakness. So it can take a lot to humble yourself, especially when you don't want to or feel like you don't have to. But Jesus addresses this as well. And so here's what happened. Matthew 17:24. Sometime after they got to Capernaum, Peter was approached by some tax collectors who were concerned with the temple tax being paid. See, there was a tax that every Jewish male was expected to pay, but it wasn't enforced. In other words, there were no legal penalties if they did not pay it. Now, the tax was supposed to be for temple maintenance, but evidence showed that the funds raised was so enormous that they had to come up with ways to use the extra money. Now, while paying the temple tax wasn't technically enforced, there would have been an enormous amount of pressure to feel obligated to do this. And that being said, there was actually a lot of controversy around the tax. So groups like the Sadducees and the Essenes and others, like rabbis, disapproved of the tax. But overall, it seems that most paid their share of the tax, and in doing so, they would demonstrate the fact that they were good Jews who were dedicated to the temple and its priests. But even still, though, when you think about the aristocracy of the temple that had developed by the time of Jesus. You think about the system of money changers that had developed and the overall corruption of this religious elite. This tax in many ways represented that corruption and the people behind it. And now they come to Peter and they want to know where Jesus stands on the temple tax. Does he pay it? See, many rabbis thought differently about the tax, and they wanted to know where Jesus stands. And so in Matthew 17:24, they get to Capernaum. They approached Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" Now, what I find interesting with this context is that they go to Peter and they ask Peter this question. Why do they come to Peter? Why is he always first in the mix? And I like to point this out every time it comes up, especially in Matthew's account. So in Matthew's account, Peter is the first disciple to be called by Jesus, Matthew 4:18 through 20. And when Matthew gives us a list of the 12 apostles, Peter is the first name on the list, Matthew 10:2. It is Peter who tries to be like Jesus and walk on the water, Matthew 14:28 through 32. Who confesses Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God? Peter, Matthew 16:16. See, it's Peter who Jesus points to as being one who has the keys to the kingdom, which I see as a reference to the Gentiles entering into the kingdom, Matthew 16:19. See, Peter witnesses the transfiguration, Matthew 17:1 through 8. He is often a spokesperson for the disciples, and he seems to have the most questions. Matthew 15:15, Peter says, "Explain the parable to us." Matthew 18:21, "How often are we to forgive?" Matthew 19:27, "We have left everything and followed you. What then will we have?" It's Peter who pulls Jesus aside to rebuke him, Matthew 16:22. And he is most prominent in the events leading up to Jesus' death, Matthew 26. So why is Peter so prominent? Well, I think it was because he was the oldest of the disciples. And as the oldest, he would have naturally been seen as a leader and portrayed thereas. Now that's just speculation. However, as you will see, he was at least 20 years old because he pays the temple tax. And that was around the age you would be expected to begin to pay it. And I find it interesting that the temple tax is only paid for Jesus and Peter, and none of the other guys, as far as we know. Coincidence? Maybe. But I love to open and explore these little windows that allow us to see a little more about the characters in these narratives. So they come to Peter and they ask him this question. And according to verse 25, Peter says, yes, he pays the tax. And when he came into the house, Jesus spoke to him first, which may indicate that Peter was intending on bringing it up to Jesus. But Jesus speaks to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" Now, some translate others as strangers, and it's just simply a word that deals with those who are not of one's own family. Now, why did Jesus ask Peter this? What's he trying to get at? Well, let's examine what Jesus says here, and maybe we can make some sense of it all. Obviously, we're talking about taxes. We're talking about taxes imposed on values and goods. We're talking property. We're talking about taxes imposed on people. So Jesus asks, do kings require their children to pay the taxes imposed on the population? Does the king tax his children or his people, his subjects? Well, Peter knows the answer to this, which is why he answers, well, from others, verse 26. See, kings don't require their children to pay taxes. They collect the tribute from the people. It's how they acquire their wealth. It's where their power comes from. It's how they are able to keep control of the resources people need to survive. It's how they're able to reorder the world to best suit them. See, Peter knows how empire works. And the king doesn't tax his children. He's trying to set them up for success, to establish themselves as potential rulers so the family can maintain their control for generations to come. So Peter understands this. And so in verse 26, when he said from others, Jesus said to him, then the sons are free or exempt. The Greek word translated free here has to do with one who is not a slave or subject, one who is exempt, not bound by obligation. So based on Jesus' response, it's easy to quickly conclude that Jesus is referencing the fact that Well, he's the Son of God, and the temple is his Father's house. Therefore, he would have no need to pay the tax. And it is interesting that it is with Peter, though, that he is having this conversation. Especially since it was Peter who confessed him to be the Son of God. And this could be something that would maybe reinforce that reality to Peter. However, I think there's more going on here. When you look at the controversy behind the temple tax, the message Jesus is starting to share with his disciples about what the religious leaders are going to do to him, I think there is another layer to what's going on here. And I think Jesus is not just talking about himself, but about Peter, about the disciples, and fellow Jews. Let's look at what Jesus does. Look at verse 27. However, Jesus says, not to give offense, which is, the word offense is interesting because it's not just simply the idea of tripping someone, right? When we do that, when we trip someone, they're able to get back up. But this is the idea of trapping them. And so when you trap someone, they're stuck. Like you trap something, it's not getting out, right? They're not getting back up. Usually a trap means it's the end, okay? So Jesus says, in order to not trap them or offend them, as some translations say, he says, go to the sea and cast a hook. Take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself. What's interesting about this, just as a side note, did you know that this is the only time we have the example of someone fishing with a hook in the New Testament? So with the hook, Peter catches a fish that had a shekel in its mouth. And a shekel was enough to pay the tax for two people, for Jesus and for Peter. But I got some questions. Like, why not just pay the tax from the money bag? Like, we know they had money. Jesus had people who helped him financially. Peter had a fishing business. We presume it was still operational. He had partners. He was successful. He had a wife and a mother-in-law and possibly other family members to take care of it. He had means. So why did Jesus send him to fish? Well, I think there's a lot of symbolism in what's going on here. There's like lots of layers. But let me share with you something that I've been sitting on for a while. And maybe you just sit on that too and think about it. So Jesus pays the tax for Peter and himself. This tax actually had a long history among the Jews, and it helped to support the most important place for them. This tax was originally a way to take care of the tabernacle and then the temple. Nothing wrong with any of that, right? I mean, that seems legit. However, notice the example that Jesus gives in comparison to this. He talks about collecting money from customs and tribute that make those in power wealthy. Think about this temple tax. Who's collecting this tax? Who has their hands in this money? So the religious leaders, money changers, and the temple aristocracy, that they were behind all of this. The same people Jesus has butted heads with, the same people he has warned his disciples about, the same people who he is telling them will put him to death. These are the people in power who control things. And everyone knows it. So between the money changers and the elite, they're making a killing off this tax. And it seems this temple tax, which had meaningful beginnings, had become just another way to make the powerful more powerful. And I think Jesus' response to Peter highlights this corrupt system and its leadership. Think about it. Peter getting the coin to pay the tax from the mouth of a fish. It didn't cost them anything. And I think it was symbolic of the fact that they, Jesus, his disciples, and fellow Jews were not held in obligation, nor were they subordinate to the temple authorities or the system that they had created, which was corrupt. So Jesus highlights the corruption and the freedom that they all had as children of God. However, Jesus pays the tax. Why? Well, because he always did the next right thing. Sure, they were not obligated, but the tax meant something to people. Yes, by paying it, he avoids unnecessary negative attention, and I agree, he's not trying to draw more attention to himself. But I think there's more going on here. See, this was a lesson in humility. He did not have to pay this tax, but he did it anyway for a greater cause. I mean, think about it. Jesus essentially says, look, Peter, I don't have to do this. There's something more important than this moment. It was a physical demonstration of the proper heart condition. See, it's no coincidence that it's in the very next section that Jesus uses a child as an object lesson to teach the proper perspective of humility. And humility is probably something most of us could use a bit more of. But why? I mean, why do we need to be humble? Why does Jesus and the New Testament writers put such a high value on humility? The easy answer is because Jesus was the perfect example of humility, and we want to be like him, so we need to be humble, and it's what he commands. To that I say, okay, that's the textbook answer. That's the answer maybe that I would, not saying you would, but that's the answer that I would give if humility wasn't really a part of my vocabulary. But to me, that still doesn't answer the question. Like, what is it about humility that is so important and valuable that Jesus not only taught it, but showed it, becoming the ultimate example of it? Well, I think the answer is found in how we define humility. See, if we're not careful, we might actually see humility as a weakness. Yeah, even if you agree that Jesus was the perfect example of humility, even if you agree that Jesus taught humility, even if you agree that the scriptures put emphasis on humility, in your heart, even if you agree with all of this, in your heart, you still might see humility as a weakness. And humility being a weakness couldn't be further from the truth. See, it takes more strength to humble yourself than it does to not be humble. See, humility isn't a weakness. It's actually a strength. It's not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. It's letting go of image management and self-promotion. See, humility is freedom from pride or arrogance. It's backing away from becoming the center of attention. It's actually what opens the door for us to be able to make the needs of others as real and as important as our own needs. And there's scriptures to back up all of this. But most important, I think, humility is what makes it possible to actually love. 1 Corinthians 13. Verse 4 says, love is not boastful or puffed up. It does not demand its own way, or it is not self-seeking. That sounds like humility to me. So such a value is placed on being humble because it's a key component to love. And well, love is the greatest of all. Everything hinges on it. Now, it might be a hard lesson to learn, and it definitely was for the disciples. But it's when the lesson is learned that we begin to reap, the fruit of the Spirit. See, humility is a means to an end. It's the gateway to really allowing us to become love. Morning, North Point. I hope everyone is... Then Jesus says, when Peter said in verse 26, well, I think the answer is because Jesus, of what it takes to love. It's a key factor in loving.